Darren had always preferred peace and quiet. After leaving his job as a biologist, he settled in a small cabin in the woods with his dog, Max. It was a peaceful life, just the two of them, far away from the bustle of city life. Every day was spent walking through the forest, watching the seasons change, and enjoying the company of his loyal dog. One evening, as the sun began to set and the air turned cool, Darren noticed something strange. A light flickered in the sky. At first, he thought it might be an airplane, but it moved in odd directions. The light wasn't right. It darted across the sky, brighter than any star. Darren squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. It vanished behind the trees, leaving him with more questions than answers. Max barked loudly, sensing something unusual. Darren looked down at his dog, a large German shepherd with sharp eyes and an even sharper sense of intuition. Max's ears were up, and he sniffed the air, his muscles tense. "What is it, boy?" Darren asked, though he wasn't sure he'd get an answer. Max barked again, pulling on the leash as if urging Darren to follow. Feeling curious and a bit uneasy, Darren decided to investigate. Grabbing his flashlight, he clipped it onto his belt and followed Max through the thickening darkness of the forest. The woods were quiet, except for the rustle of leaves underfoot and the occasional hoot of an owl. As they walked deeper into the trees, the faint smell of burnt metal filled the air, and Darren's heart began to race. After a few minutes, they reached a clearing. And there it was. A strange round object sat in the middle of the clearing. It wasn't a plane, and it wasn't any kind of vehicle Darren had ever seen before. The object was metallic, smooth, and it shimmered under the light of the moon. It was clearly not from Earth. The edges of the craft were charred, as if it had crashed here, and smoke still rose from the hull. Max growled low in his throat, and Darren immediately understood his dog's unease. He held Max's leash tighter and approached cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. Just as he took a step closer, a figure emerged from behind the ship. A woman. At first, Darren froze. She wasn't wearing clothes in the way humans did. Instead, she had a suit that seemed to change color, shifting between shades of blue and silver. Her skin was an unusual shade, almost metallic, and her eyes, large and dark, stared at Darren in a mix of fear and confusion. Max barked loudly, his fur bristling. The woman jumped back in shock, eyes wide with terror. She raised her arms as if preparing to defend herself. Darren quickly called out, "It's okay. He's friendly. He won't hurt you." Max stopped barking but continued to watch the woman carefully. Darren could see that she was frightened, her body tense and poised to flee. He slowly knelt down beside Max, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "I know you're scared," Darren said, speaking softly. "He's just a dog. His name's Max. He's not going to hurt you." The woman didn't seem to understand. She tilted her head, studying Darren, then quickly looked back at Max. Darren noticed how her body trembled slightly, even though she was trying to hide it. She took another step back, eyes darting between Darren and his dog. Darren tried again, hoping his calm tone would help. "Max is just curious, like me. He's not dangerous. He's my friend." He held out his hand, but the woman only flinched. After a long, tense moment, the woman lowered her arms but kept her distance, still watching Max closely. Darren could see the fear in her eyes, but he also noticed something else, something softer, as if she were trying to understand. She took a tentative step forward, her movements slow and cautious. "Please," Darren said gently. "I don't want to hurt you. I'm just trying to help." For a moment, the woman didn't move. Then, to Darren's surprise, she spoke. Her voice was soft, melodic, but the words were strange, foreign. It wasn't any language Darren knew, but her tone carried the weight of desperation and fear. Darren shook his head, feeling frustrated. "I don't understand," he said, speaking slowly, as if that might help. "Are you lost?" The woman looked at him, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at Max once more, and something in her gaze seemed to soften. The dog, sensing the change, took a step toward her. Max lowered his head, his tail wagging slightly. Still cautious, the woman knelt down slowly, her hand outstretched. Darren held his breath, praying Max would remain calm. To his relief, Max didn't growl. Instead, he sniffed her hand, and after a moment, he gently licked her fingers. The woman froze, her eyes wide in disbelief. She slowly stroked Max's fur, her fingers brushing over his soft coat. The fear was still there, but it was starting to fade. She looked up at Darren, her eyes filled with wonder and confusion. "Not a monster," she whispered, almost to herself. Darren felt a small sense of victory. Maybe, just maybe, they could communicate after all. But he knew there was much more to this encounter than just calming a frightened woman. She wasn't from Earth, and there was no telling what kind of trouble her arrival might cause. For now, though, Darren could only hope that the rest of their time together would be as peaceful as this brief moment. The days that followed were strange, to say the least. Darren had never expected to find an alien in the woods, and certainly not one who seemed so confused. After their first encounter, the woman, whom Darren now referred to as Vera, had reluctantly agreed to stay at his cabin. She seemed to have no choice. Her ship was damaged beyond immediate repair, and the forest was too dense for her to navigate alone. Darren had offered her a place to rest and helped her with whatever he could. Max, his German shepherd, had been the first to help bridge the gap between the two of them. After their initial awkward interaction, Vera seemed more willing to approach Darren's dog, though it was clear she still didn't fully trust him. Max, ever the gentle giant, never pushed her boundaries. He would sit quietly near her, watching with his intelligent brown eyes, waiting for her to make the next move. Every so often, Vera would look at Darren and speak in that strange language, as if she were asking him questions or sharing thoughts. Darren didn't understand her words, but he could tell that she was trying to communicate. He did his best to respond with simple gestures, pointing to objects, miming actions, anything to make her understand. Vera's eyes would follow his every movement, and sometimes she would nod, though it seemed more like an attempt to follow his lead than any real understanding. The first real breakthrough came when Darren showed her his cooking methods. He made them both dinner, a simple meal of beans and rice. He offered her a bowl, and when she hesitated, he demonstrated by eating some himself. Vera watched him closely, her eyes following every bite. After a long pause, she reached for the bowl, but her movements were slow and unsure. She raised the spoon to her mouth, testing it, and after a moment, she took a cautious bite. "Good?" Darren asked with a smile. Vera didn't answer, but her eyes softened, and she took another bite, this time with more confidence. Darren's heart lightened. At least she wasn't rejecting his food entirely. Over the next few days, their strange routine continued. Darren worked on repairing the tools and equipment he had, hoping to find something that might help Vera with her ship's damage. Vera, in turn, spent her time trying to understand Earth's environment. She carefully examined every plant, every rock, and every animal she could find. She was particularly fascinated by the trees, their bark and leaves, which seemed so different from anything she had known. Max, ever the curious one, followed her around on these little excursions, keeping a careful eye on her. It seemed that the bond between the alien woman and the dog was starting to form, though it was still fragile. Sometimes, Max would sit right by her side as she examined a flower or a strange insect. Other times, he would nudge her gently with his nose, as if encouraging her to keep exploring. Despite the budding friendship between Max and Vera, things were far from normal. Darren could sense the unease still lingering in the air. Vera would sometimes stare into the distance, her dark eyes filled with longing or confusion. She never spoke much, and when she did, it was usually only in her native tongue. Darren had no idea what she was saying, but he could tell it was important. She spoke with an intensity that suggested she was trying to explain something. One afternoon, as they sat outside the cabin, Vera stood up suddenly, her eyes locked on the horizon. Darren followed her gaze, but all he could see was the deep forest stretching for miles. Max immediately stood up as well, his ears perked, alert. "Is something wrong?" Darren asked, his voice tight with concern. Vera turned to him and made a motion as though she were pushing something away with her hands, then pointed toward the sky. It wasn't much, but Darren understood enough to recognize that she was warning him. There was something out there, something that wasn't right. For the first time since Vera's arrival, Darren felt a surge of anxiety. He stood up quickly, scanning the area. Max growled low in his throat, a sound that meant something dangerous was near. Darren's heart raced. Was someone looking for her? Had she been tracked by other beings? The thought made his stomach turn. Vera seemed to sense his fear, and she placed a hand on his arm, trying to calm him. Then, with a quick motion, she turned and headed for the forest. Darren's instincts told him to follow, so he grabbed his flashlight and hurried after her. They walked for what seemed like hours, the thick trees making it difficult to see far ahead. The sound of their footsteps was muffled by the dense underbrush, and the air felt strangely still, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Max stayed close to them, his ears twitching at every sound. Vera led the way, moving with surprising speed and grace for someone so unfamiliar with Earth. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, as though she were following a trail that Darren couldn't see. After a while, they reached a small clearing, and Vera stopped. She pointed to a cluster of rocks at the edge, where a strange marking was etched into the stone. The symbol was unlike anything Darren had ever seen before, a jagged line with curves and sharp angles that seemed almost alien. "What is it?" Darren asked, though he knew Vera couldn't understand him. She ran her fingers over the marking gently, her eyes full of curiosity and a hint of sadness. Then she turned to Darren and shook her head. "I think it's from your people," she said, her voice soft, her words broken but clear. Darren's heart skipped a beat. Was this some kind of warning, or had something been here before her? He couldn't shake the feeling that the peaceful life he had built with Max was about to change forever. The next few days were full of quiet tension. Darren kept his distance, giving Vera the space she seemed to need. She spent most of her time working on her ship, trying to repair its damaged systems. Every so often, Darren would help with the tasks she struggled with, though he had little understanding of her advanced technology. He could only do what he knew, use his tools, try his best, and hope for the best. Max, however, didn't seem to mind the quiet tension. He was just happy to be outside, sniffing the air, and exploring the woods with Vera. At first, she had been hesitant, watching him warily, but gradually, she began to warm up to Max's presence, and her fear of him seemed to melt away bit by bit. One evening, after a long day of working on the ship, Vera and Darren sat outside the cabin to watch the sunset. Max was lying nearby, his head resting on his paws as he watched the horizon. The sky was painted in hues of pink and orange, the air cool with the coming evening. Darren sat in comfortable silence, glancing over at Vera. He had learned little about her so far. She had told him bits and pieces of her life on her home planet, but the details were still unclear. What he did know was that she wasn't from Earth, and she had been stranded here alone. There was something lonely in her eyes that made Darren feel both sympathy and concern. But despite all the differences between them, something had started to form between them, a fragile bond. Vera broke the silence, her voice soft and unsure. "Why do you help me?" Darren looked at her, taken aback by the question. "Because you're in trouble. You don't have a choice right now. You need help." She shook her head slowly, her eyes focused on the setting sun. "No, I mean, why you help?" Darren paused, trying to understand her question. He thought for a moment. "Well, I guess I help because it's the right thing to do. You're not from here, And you didn't ask for this." He glanced over at Max, who had raised his head and was now watching Vera closely. "And because you've earned my trust, all I ask in return is that you don't hurt Max." Vera's eyes softened as she turned to look at the dog. Max gave a small wag of his tail, as if trying to show that he meant no harm. She reached out a hand slowly, and after a moment's hesitation, Max stood up and walked over to her. He gently placed his head in her lap, his eyes wide and trusting. At first, Vera froze, unsure of what to do. She had always been taught to be cautious, especially around creatures that could be dangerous. But Max's calm presence seemed to ease her. She slowly ran her fingers through his fur, the warmth of his body surprising her. "He's kind," Vera whispered. "Yeah," Darren replied, smiling. "He's the kindest dog I've ever had. He'd never hurt anyone." Vera nodded thoughtfully, her fingers continuing to stroke Max's fur. "I have never seen such loyalty, such trust." Her voice trailed off as she seemed lost in thought. Darren watched her closely, noticing how her guard was slowly coming down. There was still a great distance between them, but this small moment felt significant. For the first time since she had arrived, Vera was starting to see Max as more than just an alien creature to fear. She was seeing him as a friend. The next day, Darren and Vera decided to take a walk together. It was a rare moment of peace between them, with no urgent repairs to attend to or threats looming on the horizon. They walked along the winding trail near the cabin, with Max leading the way, his tail held high. Vera was quieter than usual, but there was a certain calmness in her eyes as she watched the surroundings, the trees, the flowers, and even the birds. Everything seemed new to her. Darren asked her about her home world, hoping to learn more about where she came from. She hesitated, her gaze drifting upward as if searching for words. "It was different. My planet, I mean. It was not like this. No animals. No trees like these. We used machines for everything." Darren listened closely, intrigued by her words. "So, no pets?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. She shook her head. "No pets. Nothing like that. Animals were tools, created to serve us. But they were never real, not like your dog, not like Max." Darren could sense the sadness in her voice, but also a hint of something else, curiosity. "So, you've never known friendship like this?" Vera paused for a moment, looking down at Max, who was happily sniffing at the ground. "I suppose not. I've never had anyone who cared for me like Max does for you. It's strange. But I think I understand it now." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that made Darren's chest tighten. He felt a deep sense of responsibility to help her. She wasn't just a stranded alien. She was someone who had never experienced true companionship before, never had a bond with another living creature. As they continued walking, Max trotted ahead, his eyes constantly glancing back to make sure they were following. The air around them felt lighter, freer, as though something had shifted, something they both could feel. It was a bond, a connection, slowly forming between them, something Darren never expected to find in the middle of the woods with an alien stranger. Max, it seemed, had shown them the way. The days that followed felt like a strange new chapter in Darren's life. Vera had begun to settle into a routine, helping where she could, learning about Earth, and slowly opening up. It was clear she had much to teach, and Darren was eager to learn about her world, even though he knew their differences were vast. One morning, as the sun filtered through the trees, Vera approached Darren as he was tending to a small fire outside the cabin. She seemed more at ease than before, her movements less stiff, more fluid. There was a calmness about her, a sense of curiosity and wonder that Darren hadn't noticed in the first few days. She was beginning to explore Earth through her own eyes, and Max was her guide. "How does this work?" Vera asked, gesturing to the fire Darren was building. Her voice was softer now, less guarded. Darren smiled. It's simple, really. You gather dry wood, create a spark, and keep it going. Fire is one of the first things humans learn to control. Vera looked at the flames with wide eyes, fascinated. I've never seen fire like this. We use energy in my world, not fire. Darren nodded, understanding. I can see that. Your technology, your way of life, it's far beyond anything we have here. But fire, it's something that's been part of humans for a long time. It's basic, yet powerful. She crouched down, watching the flames dance and flicker, as if trying to understand its essence. Then she looked back at Darren. We don't have fire on my world. Not like this. There are no animals to hunt, no need for warmth like this. Darren raised an eyebrow. No animals? So, what did you eat? Vera hesitated for a moment, as though recalling something distant. We had synthetic food. Everything was produced. There were no creatures to raise, no plants to harvest. We created everything we needed. It was hard for Darren to imagine a world like that. A world without animals, without the deep connection people had with nature. He had grown up surrounded by wildlife, and Max had always been a part of that. The thought of a world where living things didn't exist in the way they did on Earth felt cold, distant, almost unnatural. What's it like? Darren asked, genuinely curious. Living without animals, without pets. Vera looked down at Max, who was laying nearby, his head resting on his paws. There was a tenderness in her eyes as she regarded the dog. It's different. I never understood what it meant to care for something that wasn't useful. But now, I think I understand. It's not about what someone can do for you. It's about the bond, the connection. Darren smiled softly, touched by her words. Exactly. Animals, pets, they don't just provide. They teach us things we can't learn from machines or technology. They teach us patience, loyalty, love. Vera seemed to think about this for a moment. On my world, we were taught to avoid unnecessary attachments. They believed that emotions, attachments, were distractions. But here, I feel something different. I feel peaceful when I'm with Max. Her words struck Darren deeply. Vera's world sounded like a place of cold efficiency, where emotions and connections were viewed as weaknesses. He couldn't imagine living in a place like that. But now, she was seeing the value in the simple, unspoken bond between a human and a dog. She was learning to appreciate something real and raw. Do you miss your world? Darren asked, his voice quiet. Vera took a long breath and looked up at the sky. The blue above seemed endless, stretching in every direction. She didn't answer right away, but Darren could tell the question was heavy for her. Sometimes, she said finally, I miss my home. I miss the comfort of knowing who I am, what I am. She paused, her eyes distant. But I also feel something here, something I didn't feel before, something I can't explain. Darren nodded. I think I understand. Sometimes, we don't realize what we're missing until we experience something new. Vera turned back to him, her eyes focused and steady. Tell me about your world, your people. Darren smiled and settled back, feeling a sense of ease between them. Well, where do I start? I guess I could tell you about the animals I grew up with. My parents had a small farm, and I spent most of my childhood with the animals. I learned how to care for them, how to help them when they were sick, how to train them. Vera looked intrigued. So your life was with the animals. They were not just tools. Darren chuckled. No, not tools. They were family. We had cows, chickens, horses, and of course, dogs. Dogs like Max. They were always by my side, helping with the farm work, keeping me company when I was alone. Vera nodded slowly, absorbing his words. I see. You rely on them. But you also care for them. Exactly. It's a two-way relationship, Darren said, his smile widening. Max, for example, isn't just here for protection or companionship. He's my friend. I rely on him, and he relies on me. Vera sat in silence for a moment, her gaze drifting over to Max. He was now lying in the sun, his eyes half closed in contentment. "It's difficult to understand," she admitted, her voice almost wistful. "But I want to try. I want to understand this connection." Darren nodded. "You're learning. And that's all anyone can do. We learn from each other." As the days passed, Vera grew more comfortable with the idea of caring for something other than herself. She began to take a more active role in caring for Max, feeding him, brushing his fur, and even playing with him. She laughed when Max would roll around on the grass, his joyful bark echoing through the air. It was a sound she had never heard before, and for once, it brought a smile to her face. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was beginning to live. And it was all because of the simple, loving bond between a dog and his human. The routine that had developed between Darren, Vera, and Max seemed peaceful. Days turned into weeks, and it felt as though time had slowed in the quiet forest. They had begun to understand each other in ways that were simple yet profound. Vera was learning about Earth and its creatures, and Darren was coming to appreciate the alien woman's strength and resilience. Vera had taken up the habit of taking long walks with Max, exploring parts of the forest she hadn't seen before. Her understanding of the world was growing every day, and it made Darren hopeful that she might one day return home. But the truth was, he wasn't sure how or when that might happen. Her ship was still in pieces, and although he helped her when he could, they were both starting to realize just how much they didn't know about space travel. One evening, as the sky turned dark and the stars began to emerge, Vera came back from a walk with Max looking troubled. Darren was sitting by the fire, poking at the embers when she arrived. Max followed closely behind her, looking alert, his tail stiff. Darren looked up. "What's wrong?" Vera didn't answer immediately. She was breathing a little heavier, as if something had unsettled her. Max's ears were perked up, and he was constantly scanning the surrounding area. There was a tension in the air. I think we are not alone," Vera finally said, her voice low but serious. Darren's heart skipped a beat. He stood up quickly, looking around, his senses on high alert. "What do you mean? Someone's out there?" Vera nodded. "I've sensed it for the past hour. Something's watching us." Max let out a low growl, and Darren instinctively moved closer to the dog. He hadn't seen Max behave this way before. Max was usually calm, friendly, but now he was tense, his body rigid. "We need to be careful," Vera warned, her eyes darting around the forest. "They know we're here." Darren's pulse quickened. This wasn't a situation he had ever imagined facing. His first instinct was to protect Vera and Max, but how? He didn't know if she had enemies, or if this was just a random encounter. He had no idea who, or what, was out there. The fire crackled in the silence, the only sound that seemed normal in the strange, uneasy moment. Vera crouched down next to Max, speaking softly in her native language as she touched the dog's fur, calming him. Darren, though, was watching the shadows. The trees around them were still, but he knew better than to think they were truly alone. Suddenly, the forest came alive with a series of sharp, unsettling noises, a rustling sound, followed by the snap of a twig. Someone, or something, was definitely moving through the trees, and it wasn't a deer or a raccoon. The movement was far too deliberate. "Stay here," Darren whispered to Vera. He grabbed a small axe from the shed and cautiously moved toward the edge of the clearing, his senses sharp. Max followed him, sticking close to his side. Darren's mind raced as he scanned the darkness. His hand gripped the axe tightly, but his heart was pounding. Was it possible someone had found them? But who would be out here in the middle of nowhere? The rustling grew louder. Then suddenly, a figure emerged from the trees. Darren froze. The figure was humanoid, but much larger than any human he had ever seen. The figure's features were hard to make out in the dim light, but it looked wrong. There was something alien about the way it moved, something that sent a chill down Darren's spine. Max growled again, his teeth bared, but Darren held out a hand to stop him. He wasn't sure what this figure was, but he didn't want to make things worse by acting aggressively. Not yet. The figure stepped closer, and Darren's heart skipped a beat as he saw its eyes, glowing faintly in the dark. It was humanoid, but its skin was an unusual shade of gray, and its limbs were slightly elongated, giving it an eerie, unnatural look. "Who are you?" Darren called out, his voice steady, though his heart was racing. The figure stopped a few feet away from Darren, its glowing eyes focused on him. Then it spoke, its voice deep and strange, but the words were clear enough. "We seek the one who does not belong." Darren's blood ran cold. The alien was talking about Vera. They knew about her. Vera stepped forward from behind Darren, her face calm but tense. You came for me." The figure didn't respond immediately, but nodded slowly. "You are not of this world. You must return." Darren's mind raced. Who were these beings? And what did they want with Vera? "We don't know what you're talking about," Darren said, his voice firm. "She's not going anywhere with you." The alien tilted its head, studying Darren. Then it looked at Vera. "You cannot hide from your past. It follows you." Vera's expression hardened. She had known that her past would eventually catch up with her, but she had hoped for more time. Time to understand Earth, to learn its ways, and to feel a sense of belonging before she had to face her own people again. "I'm not going back," Vera said, her voice strong. "I choose to stay here, to learn, to be part of this world. I won't be forced to leave." The alien seemed to consider this for a moment. Then it spoke again. "You will regret this. Your choices have consequences." With that, the figure turned and began to retreat into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Darren stood still, his breath heavy. His eyes scanned the dark trees, waiting for any sign of movement. Max continued to growl, his fur bristling. Vera looked at Darren, her expression unreadable. "I didn't expect them to find me this soon." Darren placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip firm. "We'll figure this out. You're not alone anymore. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." The encounter with the mysterious figure had left a lingering unease in the air. Darren couldn't shake the feeling that something dangerous was coming. He spent the next few days keeping a closer eye on the surrounding forest, and Max, ever vigilant, seemed to share his anxiety. But the figure had not returned, and life, though tense, slowly settled back into a fragile routine. Vera, however, was not at ease. She couldn't stop thinking about the alien who had appeared in the forest. The look in its eyes, the way it spoke, everything about it felt wrong. She had never expected to be found so soon. The peaceful days she had spent on Earth, learning about life here, had been interrupted by a stark reminder of the dangers she had left behind. Darren noticed the change in her. She was quieter now, her mind clearly elsewhere. She spent more time alone, her gaze often distant as she stared into the trees or watched the stars above. Max seemed to sense her mood and stayed close to her, offering comfort in the way only a dog could. But even his presence didn't seem to ease her troubled thoughts. One evening, as the sky darkened and the air grew cooler, Darren approached her as she sat on a large rock near the edge of the forest. Max lay at her feet, his head resting on her lap, his eyes alert. "Vera," Darren said gently, taking the seat beside her. "You've been quiet. Is everything okay?" Vera didn't respond immediately. She stared at the horizon, her mind lost in thought. After a long pause, she finally spoke. "I can't run from them forever, can I?" Darren furrowed his brow, trying to understand. "Who?" "The ones who came for me," Vera said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The ones from my world. They'll come back. They always do." Her eyes were filled with a mixture of regret and sadness. "I thought maybe I could find peace here, but the truth is, I can never escape my past. It's always there, waiting for me." Darren was silent for a moment, processing her words. He didn't know what it was like to be hunted by your own people, to carry the weight of your past everywhere you went. But he could see the pain in her eyes, and it hurt him to know she felt so trapped. "You don't have to face them alone," he said finally. "I'll help you. Max and I will stand by you." Vera looked at him, her eyes softening. For a moment, it seemed like she wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. She sighed deeply, as if the weight of her decision was too much to bear. "I can't ask you to do that," she said, shaking her head. "This is my problem, not yours. You've already done so much for me. I don't want to drag you into this." Darren shook his head firmly. "You don't have to ask. We're in this together. I won't leave you to face this alone." Max, as if sensing the seriousness of the moment, stood up and walked over to Vera, nuzzling her hand. She smiled softly, her fingers brushing through his fur. "Thank you," she whispered to the dog, though her voice was tinged with doubt. "But I don't know what to do. I don't know if I can keep running. I don't know if I even want to anymore." Darren looked at her, his expression serious. "So, what do you want? What's your plan?" Vera met his gaze, her eyes filled with conflict. She had been running from her past for so long. Now, after everything she had learned on Earth, she wasn't sure if she was ready to return to that life. But she also knew that if she didn't face her people, there would be no peace. They would find her eventually, no matter how far she ran. "I don't know if I can go back," Vera said, her voice breaking slightly. "But I can't stay here either. It's not just about me anymore. It's about the future, about what I'm willing to fight for." Darren felt a pang in his chest as he realized how deeply torn she was. It was clear that Vera was not just struggling with her past, but with her sense of identity. She had spent her whole life doing what was expected of her, following orders, and living in a world where emotions were seen as weaknesses. Now, in this quiet corner of Earth, she had found something different: love, friendship, and a chance at freedom. But that freedom came with a cost. "We'll figure it out," Darren said, his voice steady. "We can't know what the future holds, but we can make sure you don't have to face it alone. Whatever happens, we'll stick together." Vera looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of doubt. But there was none. Darren's words were simple, but they held weight. She realized then that perhaps, for the first time in her life, she had found someone who didn't see her as an object to be used or an alien to be feared. Darren saw her as a person, as someone who had a choice in her own destiny. And for that, she was grateful. "Thank you, Darren," she said quietly, her voice full of emotion. "You don't know what this means to me." Darren smiled softly, though he could see the worry still lingering in her eyes. "I might not know everything you've been through, but I know this: you're not alone anymore." The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in the trees around them. The night was falling, but there was a warmth between them, a sense of solidarity that neither of them had expected when their paths first crossed. They didn't have all the answers, and they didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, they felt like they were facing it together. Max barked softly, as if agreeing with Darren's words, and Vera smiled. In that moment, she made a decision. She would fight, not just for herself, but for the chance to live a life that was truly hers. And with Darren and Max by her side, she knew she wasn't alone in the fight. The days after Vera's decision were filled with preparation. Darren and Vera both knew that they could no longer hide. The alien who had visited them had made it clear that Vera's past would catch up with her. The choice now was whether to face it or keep running forever, and Vera had made her choice. They spent their time in the forest getting ready for whatever might come. Vera worked tirelessly to repair the remains of her ship, still hidden deep in the woods. Darren helped her, although he wasn't exactly sure how much he could assist. Vera had a knowledge of technology that far surpassed anything Earth had, but her skills in rebuilding were impressive. Max stayed close, never far from her side, as if he knew that the time of uncertainty was coming to an end. His protective instincts had only grown stronger over the past few weeks, and he wasn't about to let anyone harm his new family. On the last evening before the storm was expected to break, Vera and Darren sat around the fire together, the air crisp and quiet. They knew that tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow, they would either face the aliens who had been hunting her or find a way to escape. Vera was silent for a long time, her eyes fixed on the flames. Finally, she spoke. "Darren, I never wanted you to get caught up in this. You've done more for me than I ever imagined. But I'm scared. I'm scared that I won't be able to protect you. I'm scared that they'll take me, and you'll be left alone again." Darren looked at her, his expression firm. "You're not alone, Vera. Max and I will be here, no matter what happens. We're in this together." She nodded slowly, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and fear. "I don't know if I can go back to my world. I don't know if I can face them. But I've spent so many years running, and I can't keep doing that. If I go back, maybe I can make a difference. Maybe I can change things for my people." Darren understood. She had spent so much of her life obeying orders, following a system that didn't care about her. But now she was starting to see a different way to live, a life where she could choose her own path. It wasn't easy, and it wouldn't be without sacrifice, but it was her choice. The night passed slowly, and as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Darren and Vera stood together, ready. Max was at their feet, his ears perked and alert. Vera looked at Darren one last time before they began their journey toward the clearing where she had first crashed. "We don't know what's out there," she said quietly, "but we'll face it head on. We're not running anymore." Darren nodded. "We face it together." They walked through the dense trees, the sound of their footsteps the only noise in the still morning air. The woods were peaceful, but the tension in the air was palpable. Vera's heart raced as they neared the spot where the wreckage of her ship still lay hidden. She could feel the weight of what was coming, but there was no turning back now. They reached the clearing, and Vera's eyes scanned the area. There was no sign of the alien figures that had come before, but she knew they were close. She could feel their presence, a subtle vibration in the air that she couldn't explain but knew was real. Suddenly, the same figure from before appeared, stepping out from behind the trees. This time, more figures followed, their eyes glowing in the dim light. Vera tensed, and Max growled low, his body stiffening. "They've come," Vera said, her voice barely above a whisper. The leader of the alien group stepped forward, his eyes focused on Vera. "You cannot escape your past. We've come to take you back," the alien said, his voice cold and commanding. Darren stepped forward, standing protectively between Vera and the aliens. "She's not going anywhere with you," he said firmly, his voice strong despite the fear swirling in his chest. The alien leader's gaze turned to him, and there was a flicker of amusement in his eyes. "You think you can stop us? You are nothing but a human. You cannot understand the power we possess." Vera moved beside Darren, standing tall despite the odds. "I'm not running anymore," she said, her voice steady. "If you want me, you'll have to take me. But know this world is my home now. I've found a place here where I can be free, and I'm not going to give that up." The aliens looked at each other, a mix of confusion and annoyance crossing their faces. The leader stepped closer, his hand reaching for something at his side. But before he could act, Max lunged forward, his teeth bared, and the alien leader stopped in his tracks. Vera raised a hand, signaling Max to stop. "You don't need to fight," she said, though her voice was filled with determination. "I've made my choice. I'm not going back. Not to a life that doesn't want me." The silence that followed was thick. The alien leader stared at her, as if assessing whether she was bluffing or truly willing to stand her ground. Finally, the leader spoke again. But this time his voice was softer, almost respectful. "You are strong, Vera, stronger than I thought. But understand this, you cannot change your past. It will always follow you." Vera met his gaze without flinching. "I know, but I'm not defined by it. I choose my own future now." The leader studied her for a long moment, and then, to Darren's surprise, he nodded. "Very well. We will leave you to your choice for now. But know this, our paths will cross again. And when they do, you will be forced to face what you've left behind." With that, the aliens turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving Vera, Darren, and Max standing together in the clearing. The weight of the encounter lifted, but the uncertainty of the future still loomed over them. Vera turned to Darren, a look of relief on her face. "We've done it," she said, her voice soft. "We've made it through." Darren smiled, his hand resting on Max's head. "We made it together. And whatever comes next, we'll face it as a team." Vera looked up at the sky, a sense of peace washing over her. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face it, whatever it might bring.